Solomon is again going to take a look at wisdom, and then he's going to also look at the danger of folly. And it's fascinating to me because this word folly shows up some 9 times in this chapter. So Solomon really wants to make that point home for us. And so what he's going to do is he's going to look at folly by examining the lives and the lifestyles, I should say, of 4 different fools, some of which I think we can all at one time or another identify with. And but he really brings to light the answer to the question today: does God matter in keeping you from being a fool? Because that's our only hope. And we're gonna answer this question by examining the foolish rulers, workers, talkers, and officers, with the goal that we would gain wisdom to avoid foolish living. And so here we have it, verses 1 through 7, the foolish ruler. Solomon starts by saying, dead flies putrefy the perfumer's ointment and cause it to give off a foul odor. I just liked that verse. I don't know why, because I could picture it. I guess I could picture it because I could see JT attempting this science project just to prove it to me. And so, I mean, that's what I was looking at. And he goes on, so does a little folly to the one respected for wisdom and honor. A wise man's heart is in his right hand, but a fool's heart in his left. Even when a fool walks along the way, he lacks wisdom, and he shows everyone that he is a fool. And so Solomon here compares folly with dead flies in perfume, showing us and reminding us just a little bit of folly, even in the life of the wisest person, really impacts their life. And really that is what his life is an example of, right? The wisest man ever to live. But he's writing this book of, having exemplified folly by adding just a few little flies to his life. It's kind of sad. His conclusion is this, that wise people stay away from foolishness. Think about how much of our life we would spare ourselves grief if we would just live by that simple reality, just avoiding foolishness. We would save ourselves so much grief. But why is one person foolish and another person wise? What causes that? What's the difference? Well, verse 2 tells us it's not a matter of what they do or don't do, even what they avoid or don't avoid. He says the root of the problem is the heart. It's a heart issue. Now, the heart here is referring to the center of one's life, that very thing that governs your life, that makes you who you are. And as he begins to describe this, he starts looking at your right hand and your left hand. Now, this isn't about the right-handed people being wise and left-handed people being foolish. It has nothing to do with it. But what it is it's in the ancient world, the right hand was thought of being powerful and bringing honor, where the left hand represented weakness and rejection. Many people back then thought that if you were left-handed or the left side, you were unlucky. You had no luck. The English word sinister comes from the Latin word that means on the left hand. I thought that was interesting. So what do we do with this wisdom? What do we do with this knowledge? Well, we don't start comparing right-handed people to left-handed people. What we do is we look at the heart. And we say, God, where's my heart? Is my heart in the right place? If not, then I'm going to be drawn to that which is foolish. Solomon goes on to describe this person, and he says that this is the type of person that when people try to correct them, their heart's so hard they refuse to listen to him, only revealing more and more of their foolishness. Have you ever met those people? You've tried to help, but their heart is just not there. And they've embraced foolishness. Verse 4 goes on and says, In the spirit of the rulers, or in the spirit of the ruler rises against you, do not leave your post, or for consolation pacifies great offenses. There is an evil I have seen under the sun, as an error proceeds from the ruler. Folly is set in great dignity, while the rich sit in a lowly place. I have seen servants on horses, while princes walk on the ground like servants. If there's one person who needs wisdom, it's the person that rules a nation. Somebody that is in charge of a nation, such as Solomon. And think about it. When God asked Solomon, what was it that he wanted? What was the gift that he wanted? Solomon asked for wisdom. We read about that in 1 Kings chapter 3. Solomon knew that if he was going to replace his father, the dearly beloved king of Israel, he needed wisdom. And he needed a supernatural wisdom at that in order to do what God had asked him to do. This raises the question then, what is wisdom? What is it? Lyndon B. Johnson said this: a president's hardest task is not to do what is right, but to know what is right. Wisdom is knowing what's right and then doing it. A proud ruler says and does foolish things, causing him to lose respect. That's what verse 4 tells us. And unfortunately for us, we have a lot of good examples of bad examples when it pertains to foolish rulers, don't we? They're all around us. We have these proud rulers that puff themselves up. And if a man has no control over himself, how can he control and lead other people? He shouldn't. Proverbs 16:32 says this: he who is slow to anger is better than the mighty, and he who rules his spirit than he who takes a city. Solomon wrote that. He also wrote in Proverbs 25:28, whoever has no rule over his own spirit is like a city broken down without walls. So to control ourselves, to have everything in order, to be, have that self-control. But does this mean that there's no place for anger? Are we not able to get angry and be upset about things? In Ephesians chapter 4, verse 26, we see that there is a place for righteous anger, but what does that really look like? I mean, if we're honest, not everything that we call righteous anger or righteous indignation is really righteous, is it? We've just spiritualized it. Often it's just a mask covering up hidden anger and jealousy in our lives. And if you don't believe me, just look at these very frequent religious crusades that are motivated not necessarily by the love of God and obedience to the Word of God, but by personal agendas. And they go to it in the name of God. And how many people have been hurt because of that? Verse 5-7 reminds us that a ruler that lacks character and courage puts fools in offices that they shouldn't be. They put the people around them that can't get the job done, or they're so proud that they're going to do their own thing. And I think of, as a kid, I grew up and I swore that I wasn't going to be parents like my parents. But you know what the funniest commercial on TV is? The Geico commercial, I believe it is. No, is it Geico? Or, yeah, where they're training them not to be their parents. Why is that the funniest? Because we're all there. No, don't get the party pack. That's all I can think of is the party pack. Because we inevitably go that way. We have these grand desires growing up that we're not going to be our parents. And then what we tend to do is bring foolishness around us. Think about Rehoboam. He divided the kingdom because he listened to his friends, his young guys coming up, rather than the older, wiser men that God had already established around him. And the kingdom of Israel was divided because of that. So there has to be a balance. Wisdom says there's a balance. But wisdom also tells us just to avoid foolishness. But how do we do that? Well, we cling to the one who is our wisdom. And that's Jesus. Because Jesus is the best ruler ever. And what's interesting to me is how Jesus lived his life and what he did as a king living in a different kingdom. What did he do? He avoided foolishness by making sure he spent time with the Father, where wisdom comes from. And then, what did he do? He put the most unlikely people on his team. He surrounded himself with what we would consider foolish people. But were they really foolish? They did foolish things, but they embraced Jesus. Foolishness is not making necessarily bad decisions as much as it is living a lifestyle absence with from the presence of God. God can redeem bad decisions if he's there in their presence. But if we've shut the door and have Jesus on the outside, I think of the church of Laodicea in the book of Revelation. We're told that he is on the outside, knocking, wanting to come in. And what do? We use that as a great evangelistic verse. See, Jesus is knocking at the door of your heart. But in context, what is that? Jesus is at a church where he should be front and center, but the church has pushed him out, and he's longing to come in. Yeah, that church had need of nothing, but yet they were in need of everything. Yeah, they could meet every financial need, but that's not necessarily all there is there? There's so much more. But Jesus put the most unlikely people in leadership, and he didn't apologize for it. But before you begin your battle with foolishness, check your heart. Ask God to search your heart and make it known. Reveal to you if there's any wickedness in there. If you're lacking wisdom, ask God and he'll give it to you. That's what James tells. He'll give it to you liberally. And then walk by faith in the wisdom that God has given you. Trusting that my goal is not necessarily to try to avoid wisdom, but is to walk in faith, by faith in Jesus, who will help me avoid foolishness. The second thing we're going to look at is the foolish worker. So we have the foolish ruler. Now we're going to look at the foolish worker in verse 8. I don't know, sometimes I come to passages and I can just picture these things happening. And this is one of those, right? He who digs a pit will fall into it, and whoever breaks through a wall will be bitten by a serpent. He who quarries stones may be hurt by them, and he who splits wood may be endangered by it. If the axe is dull and one does not sharpen the edge, then he must use more strength. But wisdom brings success. A serpent may bite when it is not charmed. The babbler is no different. So here we have it. One guy digs a hole, falls in the pit. Another guy breaks through a wall and gets bit by a snake. Another guy is making stones and gets hurt by it. The last guy is cutting wood with a dull axe. What do they all have in common? They all got injured. They all got hurt. Now, this is not a passage about occupational hazards. This isn't an OSHA passage, though it could be, right? They could be looking at this and saying these things. But Solomon here was describing people who attempted to do their work and suffered because of their foolishness. And then he reminds us that what the wise worker does is pauses his labors, assesses the situation, and then sharpens his tools if need to be sharpened, so that they can be more effective. The common denominator in these verses is the foolish worker. And his foolishness is his presumption that everything's okay. I just got to get the job done. Right? I just got to get her done. And the thing that I've learned is if you just got to get her done, you probably need to pause for a moment and assess the situation. Because you're going to get her done, but it's going to cause you a lot of pain and grief and sorrow. It's like trying to maintain a car with only a crescent wrench. You're going to have a busted knuckle. You're going to say things, that wrench is going to fly. You're going to have a bad day. I'm just telling you. That's how it is. Why? Because getting her done isn't the end result. The end result is doing it efficiently and effectively. These guys, they were overconfident and ended up either hurting themselves or making their job harder. We've all been told this. You need to work smarter, not harder. That seems to be our motto, but yet few people listen to it. And then he starts talking about a snake that is to be charmed. That's kind of an interesting thing. It's like, I'm not going to be a snake charmer. Like, if I see a rattlesnake, I'm not even calling the guy to relocate it. I'm just going to handle it. I'm going to get her done on that one. Because I'm not going to let it relocate and then come back. I'm not into snake charming, but I thought, well, I at least need to kind of learn something about it. And here's what I found about snake charmers. You guys now can then take up snake charming after this. I don't encourage that. But here's what I found. Snakes, they don't have any external ears. So what they do is they pick up sound waves through the bone structures that are in their head. It was more than music that was played by the charmers that would really kind of subdue these. It was more the disciplined actions that they had while holding the snake's attention in order to keep that snake under control. And therefore it became kind of like an art. Not necessarily an art that I want to take up, but it was an art form. And so as Solomon described the performer who was charming the snake, this is what they would have understood, that before the performer could subdue the snake bit him. And that was it. So he risked his life, got bit, and then he couldn't collect any of the money from those who were watching, and all they did was laugh at him. I remember going with Jim and Carolyn when Isaac was really little down to one of those fly-ins down in I think it was in Merced. And I got to be honest, I kind of got this guilty pleasure at going to these things. It was fun to watch these airplanes, and it was fun to watch the jets go by. But deep down inside, you were hoping for a wreck. That's just how it was. You were hoping to see a collision and parts flying everywhere. And it's kind of that guilty pleasure. And I would imagine snake charming was kind of the same thing. You were probably deep down inside hoping, I hope the guy gets bit because I want to see it. It's a sick pleasure, I know. But here this guy is. He couldn't get any money. He couldn't charm the snake, and he risked his life, and he ended up just being a laughingstock. That's foolishness. When we just hurry up and we just, get her done. But wisdom says this, slow down. Seek Jesus. Have you ever noticed you always have time to do something over? So why not just do it right in the first place? The third thing we're going to look at is the foolish talker. This, I have to say, is unfortunately the one I could relate to more often than not. Verse 12, the words of a wise man's mouth are gracious, but the lips of a fool shall swallow him up. The words of his mouth begin with foolishness, and the end of his talk is raving madness. A fool also multiplies words. No man knows what is to be. Who can tell him what will be after him? The labor of fools wearies them, for they do not even know how to go to the city. In Proverbs, Solomon says a lot about foolish speakers. Here, he's going to point out 4 characteristics of their speech. The first thing that he notes is this: the way that they speak in verse 12 is very destructive. And he contrasts that with the wise person's speech. He first says the wise person's words are gracious to the listeners. They spoke grace. And then he describes the fool and says the fool blurts out whatever he wants, whatever comes in his mind, and doesn't consider who might get hurt. In the end, he is the one that is hurt by what he says. In the Bible, destructive words are likened to weapons of war in Proverbs chapter 25. Fire and poison in James chapter 3. Our words are very strong. Proverbs 13:3 says, "He who guards his mouth preserves his life, but he who opens wide his lips shall have destruction." Proverbs 21:23, "Whoever guards his mouth and tongue keeps his soul from trouble." And I found that to be true. When I guard my mouth, when I don't just open it and let words come out, God guards my heart, spares me. So the first thing we see is their words are destructive. The second thing that we see about their words in verse 13 is that they're unreasonable. What they're saying doesn't make sense. The more they talk, the crazier it becomes. You ever met those people? They just keep talking. Jewish writer Shalom Alchim, he said this: "You can tell when a fool speaks. He grinds much and produces little." Why? Because their words are unreasonable. All they think of is themselves. We've met those people. In verse 14, we see the third thing is that their words aren't controlled. But there's many of them, but they're not really saying anything. A lot of words, no control, no self-control, just saying everything. And we've met those people. We know who they are. They're the people when you see them in the grocery store, you put your head down and you go hide. Because you know they're just going to keep talking and you're not going to be out of there. And then the final thing in verses 14 and 15 we see about their words is that they're boastful. Have you ever noticed that foolish people talk a lot about the future as if they know about it, everything about it, and are in control of what will happen? We see that a lot these days. Everybody knows what the future holds, and everyone thinks they're in control of it. But we're not. What's fascinating to me is there's a bit of humor here as how Solomon kind of addresses this people. He says though they boast of future plans, and there's people that are wearied because of their talk, but this guy can't even find his way to the city. And the reason it's funny is because back then, in order to get to the city, they had well-marked roads. They had to. And if you were just talking so much, this is the picture, that this guy was talking so much, he missed the road signs and couldn't get to where he was going. Though he knew so much about the future, he couldn't get there. It's like driving down the freeway, and right before your exit, there's a semi-truck to your right, and you can't get it. And you missed it. Why? Because you were talking too much. You weren't paying attention. You thought you had it all together. You were listening to the GPS instead of reading the road map, paying attention to your surroundings. It's so easy to fall into that. Colossians 4, 5, and 6 tells us this: "Walk in wisdom towards those who are outside, redeeming the time." And then he goes on, "Let your speech always be with grace, seasoned with salt, that you may know how you ought to answer each one." You see, it's better to be thought of as a fool by not saying anything than to open your mouth and remove all doubt. And it's funny because every time I'm, counseling with people, I just sit there and listen. And they look at me like, aren't you going to say anything? And sometimes I do and sometimes I don't, because what I've learned over the years is when I jump into answering the questions, I always don't get all the information. And then I give the wrong answer, and then it takes me twice as long. So what I do is, so if I ever have to do counseling with you, you know, it's not that I don't have a lot to say. I have plenty to say. I'm just not saying anything until I know God's told me what to say. And so I sit there and I pray and say, God, give me wisdom, give me insight, so that at the end you are directing people. Because wisdom says this, let your words be few, but your love be great. And the last thing that we're going to look at is the foolish officer, verses 16 through 20. Woe to you, O land, when your king is a child and your princes feast in the morning. Blessed are you, O land, when your king is the son of nobles and your princes feast at the proper time. For strength and not for drunkenness. Because of laziness, the building decays, and through idleness of hands, the house leaks. A feast made, you know what? I just realized something. I had to live that. I felt leaking in my house from the outside all week. And this is how dull I am. I should have skipped this passage. You guys are welcome. I didn't. But there it is. A feast is made for laughter, and wine makes merry. But money answers everything. Do not curse the king even in your thoughts. Do not curse the rich even in your bedroom. For a bird of the air may carry your voice, and a bird in flight may tell the matter. Twitter. But here Solomon, describes a foolish ruler, prior to this in the first few verses, and now he exposes the foolishness of the officers that are working for that foolish ruler. And he warns us of 4 different things that mark these people's lives. Number 1, in verses 16 through 17, their indulgence. They indulge themselves in things. You see, if the king is immature, the people he gathers around him will really reflect that immaturity and do what? Take advantage of it. We see that all the time. But godly leaders use their authority to build people up. But simple office holders use people to do what? Build their own authority. And we need to know that age is no guarantee of maturity either. So you could be an old guy and still be a foolish officer. Oswald Chambers says this. He says, spiritual maturity is not reached by the passing of years, but by the obedience to the will of God. And that's true wisdom. The importance is maturity, not just age. Because we've all met that guy that has just never grown up. He's usually an uncle, I'm just saying. Because we all have that uncle in our lives. The next thing that we see is that these guys are incompetence in verse 18. These foolish officers, they're enjoying what they have, so much so that they have no time to work. They enjoy the benefits of being in charge, and we're told here it causes the buildings and the organization to fall apart. Because immaturity enjoys privileges, but ignores responsibilities. There's great responsibility that leaders have. But mature leaders see responsibilities as privileges, and they use those as opportunities to serve others. It's a privilege to serve. Woodrow Wilson said this. He said, a friend of mine says that every man who takes office in Washington either grows or swells. When I give man an office, I watch him carefully to see whether he is swelling or growing. I thought that was very wise. Because, again, the human being's the only animal you can pat on the back and their head will swell. Believe the hype. Incompetent people, which leads to what? Verse 19, their indifference. They were indifferent. And their indifference declares really the foolish officer's motto, which is eat and enjoy all you can while you can. That's all they did. Satisfied themselves. They're indifferent to their responsibilities and to their position and also to the needs of the people. They've removed themselves from what's going on. Where a wise leader is amongst the people and his heart and her heart breaks for the people and is not indifferent but is involved. But then verse 20 reminds us this of their indiscretion. And then we get to that verse where it says, do not curse a king even in your thoughts. Do not curse a rich even in your bedroom. For a bird of the air, introducing us to this bird. And this is probably where that phrase, a little bird told me, came from. Originated here probably. You could imagine these guys sitting there partying it up. And instead of toasting the king, they were talking about him, cursing him, making fun of him. But have you noticed that those conversations always seem to end up back to the person you were talking about? Always seems to find their way back. So instead of talking bad about the king or a ruler or officers, what we should do, wisdom says pray for them. Pray that God would guard them. A statesman asks this, what's best for my country? A politician asks, what's best for my party? But a hireling asks, what is safest and most profitable for me? Where a wise leader asks, God, how do I love the people that you've entrusted to me? You see, if we're to avoid foolishness, what we need to do is we need to trust God, work hard, and accept what God sends to us. And then enjoy each day as a gift and live it for the glory of God and the good of others. This is such a reminder to me of how important it is for us to live for a different king and a different kingdom. Trusting that God's going to give us and strengthen us what we need through his word to accomplish whatever it is he's asking us to do. And then we need to live with an understanding of God's expectations. Experiencing to the fullest what he offers us while living satisfied with the life that he gives us. Because that's really what marks true wisdom.